So we're coming up on the first test. This is just going to be a lecture, and then there's going to be a separate video that's like a test preparation thing. So I'm not teaching you the test. I'm going to have a copy of the test, and I'm going to make sure that the important items are covered. But I wrote the test, so the important items were covered in there. So it's if you can pass the test, then you know a little bit about the important parts of the course. So it's all good. Anyway, so that'll be a separate thing. It'll be posted within a day or two, and then the final will be, or not final, but midterm will be posted on Blackboard, and make sure you obviously review that practice type thing, the prep, and then you'll take the test on Blackboard. And of course, you'll be turning in the batch of the homework around that same time. So a lot of stuff kind of coming up, but not too bad. If you watch the video, well, I assumed you watch the other videos as well, but especially watch the test prep kind of video, you won't have a big problem. And I think it's fairly fair. I mean, if I do say so myself. But anyway, it's not a lot of lists and useless kind of information. Most of it's pretty straightforward. Not a lot of math. Not a bunch of formulas that you'll instantly forget. So it's pretty useful stuff, I think. So let's talk about a little bit about insurance. We're going to talk about two different types. We're going to talk about auto and homeowner insurance, and we're going to talk about medical insurance in the second part, which is good. This is great for distance because there's zero feedback. Medical insurance never makes anybody happy because it is a broken system, and different people will agree on how to fix that system, but let's face it, the political parties, they like the broken thing. They're not seeking a solution to Middle East peace. I mean, I guess that's kind of gone by the wayside, but gun control, abortion, pick your topic. These guys aren't looking for solutions. They're looking for divisive issues that are great for elections to rally people and keep people, fighting amongst themselves on either side. So don't expect a solution to flow from the politicians because there's too much money in non-solutions. So a big dose of cynicism. We're not even a minute into it. Background on insurance. So this kind of insurance is pretty straightforward. Property and homeowners insurance. The homeowners insurance, I don't like these people. I don't like the auto insurance people either. It's kind of it's a necessary evil. Where you'd like to be in life, perhaps, is be wealthy enough to where you can be self-insured. State of Alaska is self-insured. They don't have an insurance company. They've got the deep pockets, and when things happen, they take care of it. And homeowners insurance, the reason primarily why you have homeowners insurance is because of, you have a mortgage on the property. If, most people are like, well, no, I want homeowners insurance because if there's a massive earthquake, I want to make sure it's rebuilt. Check your policy. Probably doesn't cover that massive earthquake, or at least not to the extent you thought it did. Flood insurance is right out. Flood insurance, we'll talk about that, but that's a federal program. Very expensive. I had flood insurance for a while by necessity. You know if you need flood insurance. You can get it. But most of the time people have flood insurance because it's required because they live near a river or something like that, maybe a flood area on the coast. So anyway, and then liability. Liability means that you've done something where you can be found negligent. You can be found at fault, and it's not your stuff. If your car is destroyed and it's not paid for, that's not liability. Liability is you destroying somebody else's stuff or somebody else's medical condition or something like that, and you're responsible. So damages caused that are attributed to you. And then the primary thing, and we'll talk more about life insurance at a certain point, but that's a whole separate topic. But it's to protect your wealth. So I'm not saying insurance is bad, But I'm just saying that the insurance companies, I've paid in far more than I'll ever get back. And anyway, we'll discuss it as we go. So the concepts of insurance is risk is always out there. The only way to avoid risk is to not live, basically. You stay inside the house, and even there's a certain amount of risk in that. So you have perils. Perils are things that cause the problem. Fire is a peril. Wind. You don't want an insurance policy that covers you for, say, wind damage alone, something like that. You want something that says all perils, meaning that your stuff is broken and you really don't care what the cause of it is. Now, there are legal limits that we'll talk about specifically in flood insurance that may preclude you from being covered, or there may be certain exclusions with earthquakes and other things that there will be exclusions in there for certain items, which is not in your best interest, but it's a fact. Risk management. So risk management would be things, well, we'll talk about it as we go. Avoiding risk, we already talked about that. You can't realistically go through life and completely avoid risk. You can manage risk. You can reduce risk. So let's say you're in a car. You don't drive and you would avoid the risk. But now you're a pedestrian or you're having somebody else drive you. You haven't really avoiding risk altogether is quite difficult. Reducing risk or mitigating risk, this would be something like wearing seat belts or not driving like an idiot or doing something like that will help not avoid the risk, but it will manage the risk. Accept the risk. Sometimes, there's a whole different concept. I come out of a military background, and some people are so risk averse that they're so safe they're dangerous. They cause other problems. When I was flying, for example, there was a certain point where some idiot said that we needed to fly with about 15 pounds worth of water. Well, there was so much water in the pockets of my stupid flight suit. Plus, I had a G suit on top of that, and flying in an airplane with an ejection seat. I was way outside of the ejection parameters for that aircraft, and I'm likely going to get clubbed to death by all that water when my legs are broken and flailing and beating me about the head and shoulder. Anyway, you have to apply some common sense to this. But accepting risk, when risk is low, maybe transferring that risk by way of insurance, and it's all kind of semantics, but I think you get the concept. When you can get the risk down to a manageable level, and now an insurance company will essentially accept that risk and they will take care of it. And so this is all related, insure against risk. You pay a premium. Premium is that amount to get the insurance company to accept that risk in terms of transferring it. So don't get too wrapped up in this. It's not that confusing. It's pretty common sense. Economic impact, yeah, they always want to go down this road, but people do. You find people without insurance, so you do have to have some sort of coverage. There are state laws that make it mandatory that people have insurance for liability. They don't care. The state, if you want to drive around with your own car with no insurance to cover that, that's completely fine. But what you can't do is not have liability insurance to cover those who you might harm. Now, there is a provision if you're well off, like the state of Alaska or even an individual, that you can contact the DMV and find out what the parameters are and post a bond and all this other stuff and put down a certain amount of money or a bond type thing with a guarantee of money available that meets or exceeds the state liability issues, and you can be self-insured. You don't have to insure with a third party, but you do have to prove the financial wherewithal that you could meet those same limits without insurance. Types of insurance. So we'll talk a little about property, homeowners insurance, things like that, casualty insurance, life insurance, which is an interesting concept, and then health insurance. And a lot of times health insurance, the reason why it's so controversial is because people sometimes have pre-existing conditions, and people still should be protected and have some provision to pay for their health situation, but to call that insurance, that's kind of a, let's say you're somebody with some major health issues and you go to a company and say, I want to get health insurance. And this gets even more dangerous now that they've got access to DNA data and they can kind of tell which way your life's going to go eventually, some sort of genetic risk that's already been developed, or perhaps a situation that's already kind of manifested itself and you're trying to get insurance. Well, to call that insurance is that's not really insurance. You don't go to a car insurance company and say, I need to insure my car, and say, oh, by the way, the car's already totaled out. Well, they're not going to give you insurance for that because that event has already happened. Or trying to get fire insurance for the house that's already burned down. That's not going to happen. So to call health insurance is that's where the problem is. Welfare is a pejorative term, but some sort of all-inclusive care that would cover people regardless of their current health situation is something that's good for society, but probably not under the context of insurance. Anyway, insurance companies are money-making organizations. They're private companies, and they manage risks. So they look and they look at the propensity of people to get in accidents, and they insure 1 million people, and they know that 10 are going to get in a wreck that particular day, and by charging everybody a premium, they can cover those amounts, and so that's all good. So, role of insurance companies. Car accident, car repairs. Yeah, again, sometimes some of these, car repairs like body shop repairs. You can get other types of policies that are even more problematic that deal with maintenance guarantees, which, again, sometimes are maybe not the best value. You have to do your research on that. Car accident in which a person is injured, things can get quite expensive. The medical bills and also the liability. So again, anytime there's medical issues involved, costs can go way up. A house is damaged by a fire. Neighbor while in your home, so a general liability. And part of this is going to rely on how negligent you were. If you've got a normal set of stairs and no issues with it at all, and the person just happens to fall down the stairs, they may or may not be able to sue you. But if the stairs, for example, are covered in leaves and ice, or you've got a rake or a swimming pool without a gate around it or a fence around it, those things may lead the court or whoever to decide that you're negligent, and then those costs go up exponentially. Health insurance, we talked a little about. Long-term care insurance, this is kind of a crapshoot. It can be very expensive if you have to go into some nursing home care, and you can get certain insurance policies, but you have to decide fairly early on in life whether that's going to be a thing. If you try to do it right when you're about ready to go in the nursing home, you're back in that situation where the insurance company, you're not really buying insurance because you've got an almost certain need if you're at that point in life, so it's going to be quite expensive. Disability insurance, let's say you're a roofer and you've got some sort of insurance to protect you in case you're injured, and then there can be a couple different kinds. It can be, okay, you can't roof anymore, so we're going to pay you a certain amount of money, but guess what? You can sit behind a desk, and so you have to read the policy to find out what's covered. I pursued this a little bit with an employer one time. It was just a temporary disability thing, and I found out it was completely wanting. I should have never paid them because I thought I had some coverage, and push came to shove, I had pretty much nothing. Life insurance, quite important early in life when you have a lot of responsibilities, if you have a lot of responsibilities. But later in life, maybe not so important, and it actually can get quite expensive. So we'll talk more about life insurance in a whole separate topic issue. Insurance agents and brokers, they all work on commission, obviously. A lot of these things can be purchased online with minimal interaction with an agent. Some of the more complex products, by their nature and by regulation, have to have an agent, but not always. And then you have different agents. The more standard thing is now where you have one agent that's more independent and can work with several different lines. I'm not a fan. I think that kind of the supermarket type perspective where there's a lot of carriers or a lot of agencies, that an agent can access is a bit more useful. Okay, so auto insurance, we're quite familiar with this. Like I say, there's laws that require insurance, and definitely has gone up. But it's all relative. Everything's going up. But one of the pressures on auto insurance is the role of the injury attorneys. So litigation, again, depends on the state. Maybe Alaska is not necessarily the worst, but there's still quite a few. I have some friends who are personal injury attorneys. They don't even like the system, but they do make great money at it because that's just the way the system is. So there's always no fault insurance and some of these other things to try to reduce litigation, but they haven't always been successful. So any insurance policy is a contract. Yep, we know. When you buy a vehicle, you have to tell them who's going to be driving it and what the vehicle is, vehicle identification number. All that stuff's pretty straightforward. Insurance is quoted in a series of 3 numbers typically, and you'd be surprised. The actual legal requirements are quite low, especially given inflation, given the price of vehicles. If you go with the absolute minimums, you may be at risk. So bodily injury coverage. So associated with injuries caused by the policyholder, and then property damage, other person's car, and also the state's property. If you hit some guardrail or a street sign, and you'll find out that you're going to be paying for that as well. So these are these 3 numbers I was talking about. So they have the personal injury, they have all the medical combined, and then the property damage. So 50 grand for property damage, certainly, a single vehicle can exceed that. So that's why there are these laws, and they do have the minimum required. A good agent, a good insurance company will advise you probably to go a bit higher. And it doesn't mean that they're always scamming you. It just means that use some common sense, and you probably want a bit of a higher number in most of those categories. Yep. Coverage B. So you have to read the fine print, and it does help. I mean, especially for business policies, they tend not to do those online, so you do sit there and speak to an agent, and as long as they're knowledgeable and their commissions aren't too high, they can usually insure more vehicles and different items. Than they're a little bit more flexible than some of the online type policies. So Alaska's not, well, they at least at this time they were a bit higher on the middle number there, but it's funny, you would look at a place like California, $5,000 for that property damage, and then the medical numbers are 15 and 30. So Alaska's numbers are actually fairly high compared to some of these other states, which isn't a bad thing. Fairly high. I think we're the highest out of all those. 100,000 is the highest. These numbers may be getting old though. And then coverage C for the uninsured motorists. You'd think, there's this great justice. They found out the other person doesn't have insurance and bad things are going to happen and that person's in real trouble. And my daughter was involved in an accident with somebody who didn't have insurance, and not a whole lot came of it. Collision. So this is where kind of the judgment part comes into mind. Like I say, I think I mentioned that I used to have a Viper, and it was just unaffordable. Now, it wasn't a brand new one, but it was unaffordable to have collision on it. Collision means that there's an accident that happens, it's your fault, and is your vehicle going to get fixed? And it's optional, because again, the state does not care about your personal property. They care about you damaging, another citizen's property. So if you've got an older vehicle, you can reduce your premium quite a bit by opting out of collision and just being completely on the hook if that were to happen. I'm not going to advise you one way or another. It depends on so many different things, the value of the vehicle and the rest of that, but also just how deep your pockets are and how you feel about it. I would almost, I have more bad things happen obviously in the winter with the ice and snow than in the summertime, but each to his own. Comprehensive are those other things that, especially in something like Alaska, the windshields and things like that we all tend to lose. Anyway, floods, theft, fire, hail, all just kind of the cats and dogs kind of stuff. It's not typically related to an accident. It's just something that's happened. And there are some strange situations that happen. Let's say your house burns down, your car's in the garage. Is it an auto claim or is it a home claim? Sometimes it depends on a number of different factors. Hail, don't have to worry about that so much, but riots, theft. Theft can be pretty important. Deductible, another thing where you have some judgment. Again, I tend to be more willing to assume some risk myself. So I've set on some of those, fancier vehicles, $1,000 deductible. Well, if you set $1,000 deductible, what that means is, let's say your car gets damaged and there's just a couple $1,000s worth of damage. Well, if you have $1,000 deductible, you have to pay the first $1,000, and then the insurance company cover the rest. So if you have a low deductible, let's say $250 or something like that, the insurance company knows that you're probably going to be filing a few more claims than average, and they're going to charge you a bit more for that policy. So you can get a fairly dramatic reduction in your premium if you're willing to suck it up and take that $1,000 deductible. The other reason why I justify taking $1,000 deductible is I know if I report something for $250, I may get, you know, coverage a little quicker in terms of they're going to start paying a little quicker. But the fact that I just reported a claim means that they're going to up my policy, so they're going to get their money back anyway. With the $1,000 deductible, I'm not going to be reporting very many claims. And anyway, my strategy wasn't to report very many claims because the adverse effect it would have on the policy. So that's how it works. Anyway, so the big deal with insurance is liability insurance is the legal requirement. All the other stuff is kind of fluff. Obviously, if you've got a loan on your vehicle, the insurance company or the lender may insist that you carry collision. Or if you don't carry collision, that you, again, have to post some sort of bond or do something. I had a friend one time, he had a brand new, well, it wasn't new to him anyway, BMW convertible. And he went down on the beach, and this was when I was in college, and yeah, that car got stolen. Didn't even have insurance on it, but he still had the payments. He had to pay on that car for another 4 years, and he drove it once. So be careful. Make sure you have insurance in force before you start doing stuff like that. Here's the summary. So the legally required part, uninsured, underinsured, collision, completely optional, the different types of liability, and then comprehensive. What do they base their fees on? Yep, the value of the car, the repair record. Some cars are just more expensive to fix. And then also when they're looking at the car, they know people, you know, again, the Viper in itself, well, it was a sort of dangerous car because it didn't have much in the way of safety and it had a ton of power. So they knew there was propensity. But they also knew that the type of person who drove them, you know, was somebody who was probably showing off half the time and doing other things. So they made some judgments. Then jumping right into the personal characteristics. If you're, again, a young male, they're going to charge you a little bit more. If you're driving a lot of miles, and then your driving record, if you got tickets or a DUI, they kind of own you. They can charge what they want. So there is a legal requirement to provide insurance to everybody in the state. So insurance companies, as a condition for them doing business in the state, do have to insure people. And so it's a assigned risk where we know these people are not great drivers, but we've deemed that we require them to have insurance, so somebody has to provide it to them. And so the SR22 and some of these other programs doesn't mean that they can't charge these people quite a bit of money for the insurance. But anyway, insurance companies, they have to insure a certain number of those people to do business within the state. Your location, driver's training. They'll always ask you about, have you had a defensive driving test, school performance if you're young, because they associate people with, you know, better grades with being more responsible, and then the insurance company. So to get the quotes, you have to make sure that you're comparing like type policies. So again, online's not a bad way to go with that, where you can set in the parameters and then have kind of an open marketplace. But you should always be kind of comparing prices and looking at renewals. So certain states, they don't have Alaska on here. And again, this data is now 10 years old, but it's not always what you think. Certain states are maybe a bit more expensive. Homeowners insurance. So this protects the structure. Also typically has some liability insurance in there. Fire to burglary, so it's like similar to comprehensive in terms of an auto insurance policy. But what you want is you want the broadest peril. Again, as I talked about, flood insurance can't be covered by an insurance company. It has to be done by the federal government. The problem with flood insurance is that the insurance model, let's say a private company got involved in flood insurance, and let's say they're down in Florida. And so they take everybody's money for whatever number of years, and then one of these major hurricanes comes, and everybody, when I talked about before where insurance company insures 1 million drivers and 10 get in accidents in one day, the insurance company, that's a viable business model. They can do that. But the problem with flood insurance, let's say they insure 1 million residents, and then all of a sudden one day everybody gets hit by a flood. Now they got 1 million claimants. The insurance company's going to take everybody's money for whatever number of years, and then all those claims get filed on the day of the hurricane, and they go out of business and nobody gets paid. So it's not a viable model. It's not. Floods happen to broad groups of people all at the same time. And so the insurance companies, private ones, wouldn't be able to survive in that environment. They would just be taking your money, and then when the bad thing happened, the big flood came, very few people would get paid off, and they just declare bankruptcy and move on. So that's why the federal insurance federal government gets involved in that. Here they've got broken down, and again, what you want is something like an all perils type insurance where everything is covered. We're not going to get into details on this stuff. And these are actually more categories, renter's insurance and mobile home insurance. Two different ways to go on homeowners insurance. So obviously the cheaper one is going to be the cash value, but again, you may be disappointed. Let's say there's a fire in the home and your TV's burned up or broken or water damage from the fire department and your clothes are ruined as well. They're going to come through if you just have a cash value, and they're going to say, well, yeah, maybe you paid $1,000 for that TV, but it's 3 years old, it's obsolete. We're saying the cash value, that's a couple $100. And then they go into your closet, and you're thinking, because you've got to replace many of these clothing items. Well, again, when you devalue them, when you depreciate them, they're going to say, this is worth a couple $300 for your whole closet, and you know that you're going to spend maybe a course of $1,000, $2,000 over the course of the next year trying to get your clothing back up to speed. So a much better policy, but more expensive, obviously, is replacement cost. And that's where they come in and they say, okay, the TV's damaged, a new TV costs $1,000, so we give you the full $1,000. So replacement cost is what you want if you can afford it. And this is more of the interior stuff, the interior items. The mortgage companies, the financial institutions, they just want to cover the mortgage. They want to cover the structure. They're not so interested in your personal belongings. Other structures may also be covered, and then the personal property. The other thing about personal property, there's a concept called like a rider or a personal property floater, or just in the generic term would be an addendum to the contract. Let's say that you're somebody with a whole bunch of really nice jewelry or some extensive gun collection or photography collection, and you just get the generic homeowner's policy and you think you're good, and you think, well, all my stuff's insured because it's here within the house. But if you read the fine print, you'll probably realize that different categories have certain limits, and maybe the category of jewelry is has a limit of a couple $3,000 or something like that. Nowhere near the value of your extensive collection. So the deal with this is when you're getting insurance and you've got some high value items, you need to identify them and make sure they're specified in terms of their true value, and probably even get an appraisal. And going back, since we've already talked about auto insurance, if you've got a 68 Corvette or a Camaro or something like that that's got quite a bit of value, you need to make sure that that vehicle is maybe insured by the type of company that specializes in that realizes the value. And believe me, those policies are pretty affordable under some of those specialty policies. But if you say have State Farm or something, they're just going to go, yeah, okay, it was a 68 Chevy. That car is 32 whatever, many years old, 50-year-old car. It's not worth much. So they don't tend to recognize the actual value, because they don't typically even care whether it's restored or whether it's in a barn somewhere. So you need to specify things out if you have some of those items that are of high value, and have that documented and make sure you're covered. So that's where the floater or the rider or the addendum to the contract, something outside of the generic contract that would recognize some of those specific items to make sure you've got the coverage you need. Liability. Yeah, I had a silly pig that wandered out in the road. Petunia, she was a 800-pound sow. It's a long story, but she got hit by a vehicle, and they put it under my homeowner's insurance. It's crazy. Anyway, so homeowner's insurance can cover a lot of different items, and in this case, they're covering livestock, farm animals. But more traditional liability for a normal person would be things like somebody tripping on a rake or slipping on something and trying to sue you over that. Liability insurance would be good. Again, if you've got deep pockets or a lot of stuff, you might have a larger umbrella policy, a general liability policy, which is good. Additional living expenses. Let's say that house got trashed and you're going to have to go stay somewhere. Maybe have to stay in a hotel for a number of days and some other things. Loss of use provisions. Things can get quite expensive. The disruption in your life. And some insurance policies will cover it, some will not. When I lived in Europe, I had this all-inclusive skiing insurance that would pay for the helicopter to get me off the slope in case I was pretty jacked up, but it did screwy things like it would take care of my animals, to put them on the train and make sure they safely got back to the point of origin and all this other stuff. I mean, it was an extensive insurance policy. Different countries and different states will handle insurance differently. In Europe, again, you need an insurance for your dog, because if your dog happened to scare somebody and they fall off the bike, next thing you know, you're getting sued. So it can get quite screwy, and it depends just how litigious, how many lawyers there are and what the climate is like. But you want to make sure that anything that you can be held responsible for, you have some sort of insurance. And so that concept's called vicarious liability. Like, let's say you have some ne'er-do-well child who finds some vacant house and decides to have a huge party in it and goes and causes all kinds of damage. Well, if that kid is under 18 and he's under your responsibility, guess what? You can get sued to take care of his problems. So again, you'd want to know what type of protection you have. I'm not sure you can get protection for that. Or maybe it's a little too late for protection in that case. But anyway, factors that affect homeowners insurance. So the value of the home, the deductible, the location, discounts. So if you buy a home, they will ask you questions, or maybe they won't even trust to ask you questions. They'll do their own research, but they'll want to know how close you are to the nearest fire station, how close, if there's fire hydrants in the area. And it does make a difference. They'll always give you the thing about, do you have smoke alarms, obviously? Do you have some sort of monitored security system? And is it, anyway, they'll get down in the weeds on that. The one scam, and I found that this was from the insurance companies, that they've tried to pull this on me a couple times, where they'll come to me and they'll say, I'm underinsured. Because they'll say, okay, this house is valued at $400,000 and you only have $300,000 worth of insurance, or whatever the levels are. And it's kind of a scam, because if you have a $400,000 home, typically you don't need $400,000 worth of insurance, because the property itself has got a certain amount of value. If there's a fire, the ground's not going to burn up. They'll have to replace the structure, but the structure in this case, this was a home in Eagle River, was, I think it was about $285 if it were to get, needed to be, replaced, reconstructed. But the land itself was holding $100,000 or so in value. So anyway, they'll try to pull that on you and say, oh, you need to be insured for the whole $400,000. Well, the whole $400,000 is not at risk. The land's not going anywhere. So this is a little more logical. Not a lot of hurricanes, probably not even a lot of earthquakes in Idaho. I don't know about that, but certainly not tornadoes ripping through Idaho, but Tornado Alley in Oklahoma and Florida with everything else going on. Texas has got quite a bit of storm activity, so that's more logical. Again, you can increase your deductible to pretty much any policy. And I had some flooring that was ruined one time, and it was probably going to be about $4,000 to get it fixed. And I had a $1,000 deductible. And I talked to the agent, and she said, if you report it, we will fix it, but we will up your premium. Don't you want to just pay for it yourself? And I kind of ended up having to agree with her. So, again, why do I have insurance? Well, it's because I have a legal requirement for catastrophic coverage for the mortgage, but for the rest of it, not so much. Yeah, they usually do give you discounts if you have your home, auto, and everything else, but if they're a crummy company, it's not always the greatest. They love to see you stay with the same company. But shopping around is probably the best answer. Renter's insurance, that insures your items. A lot of times in a lease now, you'll see that renter's insurance is required because they want you to have some sort of liability coverage as well. It's not super expensive, but that liability part is the part that the landlord's interested in having redundant coverage on that. Umbrella policy. So you don't have to be that wealthy. I've got like $1 million umbrella policy, and it's not that significant, but it's just kind of peace of mind. There's always going to be somebody out there claiming that something happened. I mean, I've got a campground. I've dealt with a lot of animals. I've got a lot of things, so it's not a bad thing to have. It is tough, though. They always want to know that you have some sort of coverage. To switch insurance companies is not hard, but if you don't have any type of liability and coverage and you're trying to get it, sometimes you'll set off some red flags where people think, companies don't want to think that they're taking some sort of unusual risk. They want to think that any company would take you on, and they aren't interested in taking on people who have been denied coverage or lost coverage by other carriers. So that's the auto and the property stuff. Now we're going to talk about health insurance. So good news about health insurance is this Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare, whatever you want to call it. It's not designed to cover that many people. It doesn't affect that many people. Most people get their insurance through a group policy through their employer. And then you have Medicare for older people, right? Over 65. You've got Medicaid. Those are for people that are qualified for some sort of welfare type thing. And then Medicaid for children, younger folks. Then the Affordable Care Act. And then there's and then there's this big category of uninsured. Well, guess what? There is no legal requirement to have health care. And a lot of times you'll find yourself maybe in between policies or without something. And technically you'll be covered, considered uninsured. But you can get your medical cost a lot of times for quite a bit cheaper. If you're a cash buyer. And some of you that are younger and healthier, the Affordable Care Act, the structure of it, the deal was that the younger folks were actually paying quite a bit into it. That's what made it quite expensive for most people, because they were trying to cover some of the older folks within the plan. And so if it's going to be sort of a revenue neutral thing, if it's going to be self-funding, it means that the young healthy people have to pay quite a bit to cover some of the other folks. For most young people, what you really need, but which is nearly illegal now, is some sort of catastrophic care in case you happen to 1 in a million type thing end up with some strange disease. You want that kind of coverage. But for most of y'all, when you're young, you're healthy, and your need for insurance is quite low, and you're quite easy to insure because your risk is quite low. But the Affordable Care Act, it's far from perfect, and it made that and became kind of the Unaffordable Care Act for a lot of younger people because they were burdened with paying for some of the other people in the policy. Also under this uninsured are people that are self-insured. People just say, I make the decision that I don't want to pay for it. Also, I don't know where the military people fit in here. There's a number of people who are covered by VA and other folks. And then there's other people that are in transition. So the numbers may not be as bad as they look. Health insurance, private insurance companies, the government, and for necessary repair. Now, as you get older, your need for health insurance increases. So 1 in 5, so they're saying up to 20% are uninsured. Again, when you go to, when you're looking for a job, when you're choosing an employer, the employers have kind of been driven to more of a cafeteria plan because there's competitive. Most people want to know, how much am I getting paid? And so let's say one employer who offers full benefits but only pays $80,000 is trying to compete with another employer that pays $100,000 with no benefits. Well, it's been proven that most people will go after the $100,000, and so a lot of employers have gone with what they call a cafeteria plan for benefits, where when you join with a company, when you're employed, you pick and choose which benefits you want, and you pay for only the ones you need. And there is some sense of that, especially if you're, in a relationship, a marriage or whatever, and you're both employed, you don't necessarily want redundant coverage. You don't both need health insurance. You generally go with, the one that's the better coverage. If you both have insurance, I've done this before where I've had coverage from two different companies and all they do is fight and squabble and neither one wants to pay. So it is best to have a single insurance company, and a cafeteria plan would allow you to do that. But also under a cafeteria plan, you would choose your medical dental if you wanted that, your long-term care, and a bunch of other decisions that you get to choose. Identification of insured, where you're going to be, and then the pre-existing conditions. So that's the whole problem. That's, trying to insure the car that's got a few dents in it. Again, it's not a comfortable discussion when we're talking insurance because you're talking people's lives here, and you're talking what can be some of the most significant expenses. So to call that insurance is kind of a misnomer. Cancellation, renewability options. What I've found with most employers is they have sort of an open season, generally in the fall, where you can make changes to the policy, and it's a window that's open for a month or 6 weeks, and then you have to change around. Other coverage, rehabilitation, mental health. Again, that might be under the cafeteria options. Pregnancy, if that applies to you. Dental. I was recently approached by a dental insurance because I went under a self-employed program, and the lady who was trying to sell it to me, she acted like this was completely logical, that I was going to spend $50 a month for dental insurance, and the maximum they would cover per year was $1,000 in dental expenses. So I'm having to fork over $600 in premiums, and if things go horribly wrong, I get $1,000, best case. I would go self-insured at that point. That's silly. Or I'd find a different carrier or something. But sometimes insurance policy, you have to look at what the limits are. And vision insurance, again, is something. Vision is usually, because it's a very competitive marketplace. It's not like medical, where medical is not such a competitive market. Hospitals don't tend to compete like that. But for some of the surgeries, especially vision correction surgeries, they're quite affordable just because there's a lot of competition out there and there's a lot of price pressure on the providers. So unreimbursed medical expenses, deductibles, co-insurance, limitations, coordination of benefits. So anyway, when we talk about the deductibility of medical expenses in terms of taxes, if you remember, you don't even get to begin to deduct medical expenses until they hit it's 10% of your income. So let's say you're making $100,000, $10,000 worth of unreimbursed medical expenses. So you got to be, you're pretty sick at that point. It doesn't take a whole lot to get above 10,000, and if you're going to hit 10, you're probably going to go quite a bit higher. Expenses not covered. They do have some medical savings accounts. They have other items. You have to look at what your options are. But for some of these policies, especially under the Affordable Care Act, where the premiums per year were about $9,000 a year, you get insurance to prevent a financial catastrophe. A $9,000 per year medical insurance kind of is a catastrophe in my mind. So the whole medical situation, medical insurance, really needs some attention. But there's not a champion out there. There's nobody who's really happy with the current program, but yet it just sort of limps along. We talked about Medicare. So this is for older people, 65. You guys are not quite there yet, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time there, but it does take a big chunk of people. Medigap, there's always going to be infomercials about some of those little gaps in their insurance that are not covered. A lot of people don't want to spend a dime when they go to the doctor, but they will pay monthly insurance policies to avoid that $30 charge. Anyway, Prescription Act, you've heard all about this, where they're trying to get prescription coverage. That's the Part C. Medicaid, so families with dependent children, more of a welfare type policy and done by the states. Federal program, federal funding, but state. So it's been since 2010, that's like 12 years, and still not right. The pre-existing condition, so it's kind of doomed when you put people under the policy who are going to be known to be drawing heavily on the policy and then expect the program to be self-funded, funded from the other people in the program. It doesn't work out for anybody. Long term, so nursing homes, assisted living, can be quite expensive. The deal though with long term, and this kind of came out during COVID, a lot of people died in nursing homes, but the bad news is if you go into a nursing home, I think the statistics are within 6 months, 50% of those people are passed on. So you're not in a great position if you end up in one of those facilities. Me, I have no problem going overseas. There's lots of cheap places. I'll sit on the beach and drink margaritas and talk about what a great life I had and work out those last couple years. Long-term insurance policy. So again, you kind of have to. You'll spend yourself into poverty. All your assets will be gone, and then finally you'll qualify for the program. Most of these insurance provisions I've just found them to be kind of wanting. So the provisions of the policy, obviously the more extensive the policy, the more expensive it's going to be. The age in which you make the decision that you're going to get the long-term condition, and if you've already begun to deteriorate, you're going to have a tougher time getting it. So this again gets kind of controversial because the insurance companies would love to have your family medical history. And what can you do? What's your financial situation? Disability insurance, so this is to get you back to work, or if you can't work. This is what I was talking about before about, let's say you're a roofer and you fall off the roof, you can't work anymore, you can't be in your own occupation, and you're 100% disabled out of that position. But if you have a more restrictive policy, well, you can't roof, but that doesn't matter. You're for any occupation, so you're still 100% in terms of office work or something else that was, relatively light duty. So you might not have the coverage you think you do. There is individual. You also have the state involved, and then Social Security. And then workman's compensation, which we're aware of. When you look at your paycheck and you see deductions taken out, that has to do with disability insurance. It definitely makes a difference if you're injured at work. you want to definitely make sure that that's captured. If you end up somehow with some sort of long-term disability situation, it definitely would behoove you to have it identified as work-related, as opposed to, happen because you're out snowboarding or something. How would they pay? Percentage of your income, probationary period. So, again, this is to prevent people from perhaps already being disabled and trying to apply and get coverage. The waiting period goes along with that. And any sort of provisions, you need to read the fine print. I worked for a pretty reputable company. It's a Fortune 500 company. And when I went to file under the disability insurance, I found out that the person or the company they contracted with was the absolute worst bottom of the barrel. And they, I dealt with call centers for a couple of days till finally it was just denied. And by that point, I was done with the employer anyway. So, again, some insurance companies, there are differences amongst them, and there are companies that rate insurance companies. So reviews or customer reviews and rating agency reviews are very important when you're selecting insurance. Okay, so just the quick review for the midterm. It's going to be a separate tape, separate recording. But it's going to be on Blackboard, no Proctor, no RPNow is the system they were using. We're not doing that anymore. So there's going to be 40 questions, multiple choice. When it hits 60 minutes, the thing will just close. So don't press that limit. Definitely watch the review video if you want to do well on the test. And yeah, you can use a calculator if you want to. It's supposed to be a closed book. Kind of tough to work that, but the thing is that 40 questions over 60 minutes, if you're trying to look things up, you're probably going to run out of time, so that sort of takes care of itself. And that's it.